Hi, my name is Joe Jackson. I'm an interviewer and a broadcaster. And what you're about to hear is one of the 1,400 interviews I did for publications such as the Irish Times, Sunday Independent, Hot Press Magazine, and for RTE Radio 1. How do I know there are 1,400 interviews exactly? Because I recently digitized all the damn tapes myself. But do remember that many of the interviews were done for the print media and recorded on cassette tapes. So some are, let's say, sonically challenged. But I happen to believe that sonic considerations should give way at times to historical significance. And I'm glad to say that at least some powers that be in RTE Radio 1 agreed with me on this and broadcast between 2015 and 2018 many of my interviews in a series called The Joe Jackson Tapes Revisited. What follows is a program that was made for that series but never broadcast. However, it has been edited for this podcast. The full tapes can be accessed at joejacksoninterviewer.com. Either way, enjoy. Hi, welcome to the Joe Jackson Tapes Revisited. And first let me say this, the tape I revisit tonight is relatively famous or infamous depending on your perspective. It was recorded on February the 13th, 2002 in an office in Leinster House, and the interview itself was published in an Irish newspaper 4 days later. However, the interview really only hit the news big time 9 years later when its subject, Senator David Norris, entered the race to become the next President of Ireland and found himself almost immediately caught up in controversy. I then was asked, on May the 30th, 2011 to be precise, to talk to Joe, as in Joe Duffy on Liveline, about the tape I'd made with Norris in 2002, though we had recently done another interview. 2 months later, after I used the uncensored text of the original interview as the opening chapter for my book, David Norris Trial by Media, I was asked to discuss it again, this time on This Week. The interview also was widely quoted in newspapers and on the internet. Then in 2012, Norris, in his own delicately titled autobiography, Kicking Against the Pricks, a line that incidentally comes from the Bible, wrote the following about our first interview, alluding to the controversy. I did an interview with Joe Jackson in the Sunday Independent within the next few days to make it plain how I abhorred child abuse and had a track record battling it. To this day, I am very grateful to him for what he did at that stage. At that stage. There's the sting in the tail, or the kick against whatever. And that line, I shall take a kick at trying to explain near the end of the show. But for now, let's start at the very beginning of the actual cassette tape of that interview. The previous Sunday, I'd interviewed for my weekly slot in the Sunday Independent Paddy Cole and Ronan Collins, and given the latter space to respond to a cheap shot that had been fired at him by Louis Walsh. Ronan had said on air that the single, There's a Whole Lot of Loving Going On by Six, one of Walsh's pop bands, was absolutely awful and lacking in credibility, imagination, and musicianship. Yo, Ro, don't hold back. Louis then responded by describing Collins as a failed showband star. And, taking a swipe at his charity work, he added he should go back to saving the children of the world. I tapped into all this in order to tell David Norris my primary aim for our interview.
Who was it you were talking to last week?
Angus and Ronan and the week before was Louis Walsh, and then it was Ronan.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Ronan and Paddy Cole.
Yeah, that's
Ronan
right.
about the attack on him by Louis Walsh, which was pretty merciless. Just his charity work.
It was miserable.
But I gave him a chance to actually articulate, and a lot of people thought when he talked about what the children actually meant to him, what that meant to him, it really negated and reduced to drivel Louis' attack. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing. So anyway, the first couple of questions will hopefully allow you to do the same thing with the other ones.
Right.
As you heard there, I was a little off mic. So during this show, I shall revoice some of my questions. But okay, what was that comment the other ones referring to? Specifically the fact that 4 days earlier, a headline on the front page of Ireland on Sunday had said, Senator backs sex with children. And under that was this subheading, Fury at gays, pedophilia is okay, message. Those claims were based on comments Senator David Norris allegedly had made during an interview with Mary Lucy Burke for McGill magazine. I then bought the magazine, read it. On Liveline, I mistakenly said I hadn't. And I felt that Norris's comments had, at the very least, been sensationalized. Then one of my commissioning editors at the Sunday Independent, Mary O'Sullivan, said she'd read the article and found Norris's quotes to be deeply disturbing. So I decided to interview the man. Because let's just take people like myself who saw solely a headline on Ireland on Sunday, Senator backs sex with children.
Yes.
What was your response to that, and what has been the repercussions of that?
My response was horror. I mean, I was driving to Limerick and I saw this on the newsstands, and it so completely misrepresents everything I said. Even in the interview with Helen Lucy Burke, I said, I cannot understand how anybody would consider it appropriate to have sex with children, and that the penetration of juveniles of either sex was always wrong and harmful. So I can't understand how people could say that I backed sex with children. And after all, if you look at my record, I was one of the most prominent supporters of the Stay Safe program for children in schools. Okay. The whole thing seemed to be twisted and misinterpreted in a highly damaging way. But at the same time, I knew what my views were. I knew what my record is. And I felt and hoped that people who followed my career over the years would know what my record was and what I stand for, that I am a decent person with reasonable values, even though I'm prepared to look at controversial areas in, I hope, a calm and responsible way. And I also condemned incest. So how they made out that I wanted to legalise it is just simply beyond me.
Well, the difference I saw too was saying, well, you had that, and if you would address, Mary, saying that you seemed to endorse it and that she'd seen too much grief caused by the whole subject and couldn't quite believe. But a careful reading of the article would suggest that's not what you were saying at all.
That's right.
You were very aware of the grief and trauma caused to people by this.
I think she was caught on the hop. Because I think she was just, she did say to me that she hadn't fully read the article and it was just glanced at. So, she was just asked for a response, phoned up cold. But, you see, and the irony is, this isn't a subject I'd expected to be dealing with at all. And, I do find, saving your good presence, that so often people approach me for an interview and the only thing they talk about is sex. And then people think I'm obsessed by sex. I'm not. I mean, I'd love to be talking about the Metro, foreign affairs, human rights, these sort of issues. But, I've been kind of tagged, and I think it is rather a pity. But again, you asked in terms of the response. Yeah. Well, I've had a remarkable response. It has been extremely supportive. And I'm very pleased.
Fellow politicians are
from fellow politicians, from the public, from journalists.
From family? From everything?
Yes, absolutely. I've had one questioning letter, which I've just written back to, explaining the situation. But I can't do that. I can't write to the entire Irish public. Okay. But even the day, even the day it appeared, I was driving down the country. My engine boiled over, and I went in to ask for water, and this strapping young man came out with two lovely golden-haired daughters. And I said, I'm afraid my car's boiled over. Can I have some water? And he said, aren't you the Norris fellow? And my heart sank. He said, I've just been reading about you. He said, of course I will. And he was so kind and pleasant. And, people in shops said, you wouldn't want to believe that old rubbish. Paper never refused ink. So it was most unpleasant. But there we are.
I then suggested to David Norris that we break down a quote that was central to the controversy, namely this comment, which he again allegedly made to Helen Lucy Burke. She claimed Norris said, I haven't the slightest interest in children or in people who are considerably younger than me. I cannot understand how anybody could find children of either sex in the slightest bit attractive sexually. But in terms of classic paedophilia, as practiced by the Greeks, for example, where it is an older man introducing a younger man or boy to adult life, there is something to be said for that.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at classical Greek mythology, and I have a letter just received today from the professor of Greek in Trinity saying he completely understands what I was saying, but of course it's a dangerous subject to raise. And it was actually pederasty, not pedophilia, which is a different thing. But the magazine put pedophilia, so that was wrong. But however, yes, I also, you see,
it is a dangerous area, though, isn't it?
It is a dangerous area. Now,
the nuances.
I would say, you see, when I was growing up, 40 years ago, I was 17. it was illegal to be gay.
Right.
People were driven into the bushes, into public lavatories.
Yeah.
And that was all that there was for them. Now, if somebody a few years older, who's handsome, athletic, and so on, came along, I think the majority of young gay people would say that would be a better alternative to be introduced in a positive way. But again, it is so sensitive that I really don't want to concentrate on it at all, because I made the point also in the article that people get so head up about it, understandably if they're parents, and people don't draw a distinction between paedophilia. They don't know what the difference, even pediatrics. I mean, there was a pediatrician in England. Her clinic was burnt to the ground because the people didn't know the difference between pediatrics and paedophilia. A man who was the same name as somebody on one of these lists run by the gutter press, Name and Shame, he was beaten to death.
Right.
A well-known TV journalist who took photographs, snaps of her kids in the bath. She sent them to be processed by Boots. They referred them to police. She was arrested and interrogated, and the kids were questioned. Now, I'm sure that must have been traumatic for the children.
Right.
And I think that that kind of hysteria is wrong.
All right, we don't want to feed into that, and I don't want to feed into it with this article either. But when I first read it kind of casually, when I saw the quote about when I was younger, I would have welcomed an older man, I thought that's a nice way of putting out a free ad. But you categorically say, putting out an ad for yourself, trying to find a younger partner.
No,
but you also say in the article, which they didn't put in the paper, that even that is not of the slightest interest to me.
Not at all.
So it wasn't a classified ad for David
Not in the
Norris.
slightest. In fact, I still like an older man.
Okay. When you say there that when you were 17 and you were coming out, was that problematic? Was that the scenario you depict? Is that how it had to be for you, into lavatories, into loos, into parks?
Not really,
Shaded and
because,
shadowed?
I was aware of that.
All right.
But see, I got so much involved politically that I had to lead virtually a celibate life and concentrate entirely on the political
At what
things.
level?
But I got involved very early on in the movement for reform of the law. I mean, the end of the 60s, I was already starting out. That's over 30 years ago.
Okay.
I always felt I was entitled to a bit of dignity in my private life. And these kind of furtive encounters weren't what I wanted.
All right.
And I found, curiously, that when we were running the counselling service, a lot of people would get in trouble with the police. And they'd be the most respectable people.
Right.
Lawyers,
Right.
writers, artists, doctors, priests, journalists, yeah, I'm sure they were. But there were all these kind of professional people, and they wouldn't come into the disco. They'd be afraid.
Where
But they would
Where
expose
was
them.
this disco? Where was
Well,
it?
it started off in Great Strand Street, then it moved to...
It was a gay disco.
oh, yeah, the Hirschfeld Centre was the principal
Oh,
one.
the Hirschfeld Centre. Yeah, the Hirschfeld Centre. Okay, so that's where it was, and you were involved with that.
From the beginning, I started it.
All right. Okay, so but you were not inclined towards those kind of furtive relationships?
No.
Even from your first explorations?
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't something that appealed to me.
All right, okay. Were you romantic? Did you fall in love young?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Was it more that?
Absolutely. Yes.
How old were you when you first fell in love?
I suppose I would have been about 13.
Okay. Who was it? Can we see? You didn't give a name. Was it a teacher? Was it a friend?
No, it was an older lad in school.
All right, okay.
And I thought he was wonderful. He was a good rugby player and all this kind of stuff.
Was it reciprocal?
No, not at
Oh.
all.
Did you even tell him?
No,
Would you have? Or would you have been afraid to?
didn't get the opportunity.
Would you tell him now?
No.
But at 13, you were obviously very aware early that this was my inclination.
Oh, yes.
And was it problematic for you there? Because I know part of the scenario that we talked about in the paper is where you say an older man coming on and awakening you to the sexual realities, or a younger boy. There are the parents who will come back and say, if a child is left to the norm, they will go through a homosexual phase at 13 and come out of it.
Yeah.
But if they're inclined towards a direction that's a homosexual male saying, this is where you should be, that perverts them. Now, I'm using all these words in inverted commas.
I don't think so, but I also think that open discussion is the best. I mean, I remember very early on, we had a situation where we used to go around the country and we would advertise discreetly and say we were in such and such hotel. But I think one of our great successes was this lad who came in, and he was really in a terrible state of tension and unhappiness. And we spoke to him and we corresponded with him. And the lovely thing was you could see the relief in people just talking to another gay person. But he got in touch with us some months later to say he couldn't thank us enough.
Right.
His real problem was that he'd been masturbating and he thought that this meant he was gay. And when he was able to look at it in a calm light, he discovered he wasn't. And he just met this lovely girl. And he said, could you stop sending the newsletter? Because he thought that she might be concerned. Now, I was absolutely thrilled because I felt the principal thing is to have somebody happy with their identification. And I just have to see if this is a vote. My view was, here we had, as a result of our intervention, we had somebody who was a happy, balanced heterosexual. Right. The alternative would have been to have an unhappy person who was pushed into the situation of being gay.
All right.
There, David Norris was referring to a vote in the Dáil chamber, and soon afterwards he did have to go and cast his vote. He was saved by the bell, you could say. I'm kidding. But seriously, I know that the sound of that alarm is alarming, but I want to leave it in for a while longer, if only because what Norris said next is hugely relevant in terms of subsequent developments in this story. I also must stress that I see my role as an interviewer mostly as that of a conduit, a kind of channel through which people can express their opinions, irrespective of where those opinions stand in relation to mine. Likewise, in terms of the questions I ask. All of this certainly applies to the part of that last exchange when I suggested to Norris that some parents might say that a young boy going through perhaps a period of homosexual exploration and being told by an older homosexual, this is what you are, that this might pervert him. Likewise, when I returned to that subject and asked Norris to further address those fears of such parents who might say that if an older man takes a younger man under his wing, he may lead him down the wrong road. Sure, aren't we all on the one road?
Well, I'm sure there may be the possibilities of seduction in this sort of business, but I don't believe that people, mature people, I think young people are quite mature these days. I doubt if they would, and I doubt if they will be easily seduced in this way. And if they are, then it's an abuse. It is an abuse. And you can abuse your position of authority and trust, and that is always absolutely wrong. Right. You can abuse it if the person is mentally handicapped. Sure. You can abuse it if you're as an older person authority, a teacher, something like that. So these are all abuses.
Okay, enough of that damn alarm, I hear you say. So instead, now let me do something that may be just as alarming for some people. As in, read from my book, David Norris, Trial by Media, a short exchange David and I had before he left to vote. I suggested that a 17-year-old reading what he'd just said might think Norris decided at 13 he was gay, fell in love, and that was that. But was it, I asked him, that easy? He then said, by no means was it easy. I lost all my youth, all the experiences of young manhood, going to dances, holding hands, going out on a date to the cinema. All my friends had that. I had nothing except a stifling sense of isolation and loneliness. I asked him, from what age to what age? He said, I don't think I consciously met another gay man until I was in my middle 20s. Even going through Trinity, I didn't know a single other gay person. 10 minutes or so later, David Norris returned to his office and hurriedly closed the door. Then he began to cry. Norris didn't explain why at that point, but he did gesture for me to resume the interview.
Clearly, this is more disturbing than I had realised when you first talked to me.
I think it's the cruelest thing that has ever happened to me.
All right.
And I've lived with it with a clear conscience, but it has been immensely painful. And I've suffered attacks before, but nothing like this. And I can control it consciously. When I go to sleep at night, I can't. I've been racked by nightmares. I just kept going.
Nightmares of what? The one you described to me of the...
Yeah, I don't really want to go into details of it, but nightmares in which I'm unjustly accused of all kinds of terrible things which I have never done.
But why does it wound you so deeply? Why did a scurrilous headline or misrepresentation of an interview in a magazine wound you so deeply?
Because I have fought for the rights of people who are damaged and underprivileged and abused by society. And this is an attempt to put me in the camp of the abusers.
Right.
And it's just cruelly wrong.
Right. But it clearly hasn't worked. You've told me that you have letters of support and you've only one negative letter, one negative...
Yes, there was a questioning letter.
Yeah.
But it's still a terrible thing.
But the people who know you and the people who love you and your family and your friends and former lovers, partner, if you have one at the moment, they all would know this is so untruthful, so unfair, and he should not allow it to get into his soul. Don't you think that? But you can't keep it out. If it creeps in even when you're sleeping.
Yeah, I would never have thought that anybody would believe a thing like that. And my record is so clear. And what I said is so clear. That I'm against abuse, that it horrifies me. And I understand the pain of the victims. And you see, the thing is, I have worked very constructively in many areas. I was largely responsible for the formation of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Myself and Michael D. set up the Foreign Affairs Committee. I've worked with human rights. I'm just back from a visit to Thailand, where we were looking at the situation of HIV and the trafficking in women and children for sexual purposes.
Right.
I was asked to be the leader of that group. And I was successful as that leader,
Right.
And responsible. And then I come home to find this.
But it won't ill affect your position politically, will it?
One can never tell.
Right.
One can never tell. Mud sticks.
Have you any defence against this? Had you any defence?
No.
You had no retaliation on the day? No, there's no way you can respond against?
Not really. No, except to rely on the fact that my record speaks for itself. And that I've lived a decent life. And that I've helped people in difficulty.
All right.
And...
So that day when you saw the headline, you didn't just look at it and go, oh my God, I misrepresented it. It cut. Or was it late? Or was it later that night when you went to sleep? Or did it immediately go, good Christ?
It was the whole day. There were two parallel things. There was my knowledge of myself and my knowledge of what I had tried to say. And then there was this complete misrepresentation, is all I can say.
All right, okay. Listen, I don't need to go any further into that, because between what we said earlier and what you said there, that can be the end of that.
Yeah.
Unless there's something else categorically I can say that will help you.
Well, the only thing is I can say I trust the decency of the Irish people. I always have.
Right.
And I hope that this is not the beginning of a tabloidization of Irish political life, and that other people will find themselves victims of this terribly painful and unjust procedure.
Right.
I hope we don't go down that way. That's what's happened in England.
Yeah.
And I really hope it doesn't happen here, because it's terribly cruel and it's terribly wrong. And it doesn't help political debate.
Okay. I think I want to leave the subject there.
Right.
And I did want to leave that subject there for the time being, because it clearly was distressing for David Norris. Besides, this interview, unlike the next two I'd do with the man, was not for the news pages of the Sunday Independent, it was for the living section. So I needed to know more about his life in general. Quite, but not quite yet. So let's leave until podcast number 2 in this 2-part series, the rest of that interview, in which David and I look back over his life, but also return to the controversial subjects at hand. If you want to read the article I wrote based on this interview, check out my website, joejacksoninterviewer.com, where you also can buy an ebook version of my book, David Norris, Trial by Media. Thank you for listening.